when we are live once again after the holidays. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to anyone watching live now or later. It is my absolute pleasure to be joined tonight by Nathan Allen. Nathan, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a long time in the making, isn't it? It's been because you first contacted me when. Um,
Oh, a while back. I can't remember now.
I think it was before summer.
Yeah.
I think I've read your book just kind of around July time, and I think it's like we kind of scheduled the conversation for after the holidays. So, for anyone who may not be familiar with you or your work, introduce yourself, more or less, give us an insight as to what you do, who you are, please.
Absolutely. Thanks. So my name is Nathan Allen. My day job, if you will, is at Lucasfilm. I work on the animated Star Wars TV shows. You can see some of my paraphernalia from that behind me. Worked on the Clone Wars, some other shows, Resistance, Bad Batch, all sorts of different things. So that's kind of what I do during the day. I work on films and then those TV shows, and then I write with my own time. The book I wrote and the one we're going to talk about today is The Heretic. So this is my debut novel. It's right here. And thank you so much for reading it and for your review. It was so much fun to watch. And thanks for having me on.
Oh, I don't know. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I don't know that my reviews are any good, but I have to say, first of all, I'm impressed by your ability to hold a day job, which we can talk a little bit about it. That I'm assuming it's got its demands and so on. Being able to write at night, and what people don't know, you haven't mentioned, but we've talked about it before going live, is that you got 3 kids. You had one a week ago. So how do you juggle all of that? Because I gave up writing when my kids were born. Sort of, for anyone that doesn't have kids or anyone that has got kids, they know this. It's not that they say that having kids is not like getting a new car. It's like a 10-ton truck smashing into your living room, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. So, kind of two stories for that, or two answers. One is I did start writing before I had kids. So, it's been a little while in the making. And my oldest is 3, I should say. And so I started before he was born. And I would do it as part of my commute. So on the way to work, I used to live in San Francisco, and I'd commute an hour and a half each way. So I'd be on the bus or the train, just typing on my little laptop. And so that's kind of where it started. And then kind of since then, and this is also kind of how I do it with kids, is that commute time. I work remotely now from home, and I kind of kept that into my schedule baked in. And so I kind of just maintain, if I can, maintain that time as writing time, a little bit before work and a little bit after work. So that's kind of how I fit it in. But then what you're saying with kids too is like, yeah, it's huge. When I had my first kid, I didn't write for like a year. I didn't touch anything. So it's definitely a lot. It takes a lot. But the reason I was able to do this is my wife, she's kind of been like, are you going to keep working on your book? And she's been really supportive, and that's been really helpful.
Fantastic. Yeah, because it does echo a little bit when I wrote my first book as well. It was again that long ass commute. I used to live outside of London, and it was like a 1 bus 2 train type commute. So all that time, yeah. I think there's probably a lot of first novels written
on transit
on public transport. That's right. And so then that's also very commendable. So as much as you can, I suppose, are you kind of the Stephen Skin school that you try to sit down and hit a word count kind of goal every day?
Yeah, that is kind of my general methodology. Before I just am writing, I'm doing a lot of outlining and plotting, and so it's not quite a word count goal then. But for the most part, I have some word count goals, but the big thing is probably more of an hour, or the time block is my real goal. So like if I don't quite hit a certain number of words, that's okay, as long as I make sure I'm putting in the time. And I find that generally if I block off the time and I sit down and I start, I do hit my word count goals as well. But I do feel like even if I'm not feeling it, I just kind of gotta do it. That's how I operate, at least.
Yeah, and it's quite amazing how when you get into the habit, it
Mm-hmm.
gets easier, doesn't it? I think Thomas Mann said, the famous quote that a writer is only someone for whom writing is harder than for everyone else. But it's a little bit like everything. The more you sit down every day to write, it does become easier. But you mentioned something there about sort of plotting and planning your novel before you. Uh, Obviously, does that help? Like if you know that you need to get from A to B, then it's easier to fill the gap.
Yeah, I think plotting is huge for me. My first draft of this book was, I mean, it was awful, and I had a lot less planning and plotting at that point. And so when I
Right.
finished the book and I kind of like revisited and evaluated it, I was like, okay, I need to fix a lot of things. And the way I fixed it was with plotting and outlining. And then when I was writing and I had that, it was a lot easier to be like, okay, this is what I need, what needs to happen. Not just like this person needs to be here and this and this. It's like this is what I need the audience or the readers to feel and what I need, like things like that. I make a lot of notes kind of in that regard in my outlines, and having that really helps me. In fact, like when I'm not feeling super inspired to write, generally how I'll start my writing process is I'll read my outline, my plotting, and say, okay, this is what needs to happen in this chapter. I'll kind of read the chapter before and I'll read the plotting for the chapter after, and like kind of gets me into the mood and gets me thinking about it, and that kind of helps spark the
Hmm.
drive.
I don't know. That's very interesting. Um, but so taking a massive step back here, obviously your chosen career is animation,
Mm-hmm.
and but did you always have the writing bug then?
No. So one of the things I love about the entertainment industry and in animation is everyone is talented and creative. And I'm sure that's true in plenty of places. But I see all these people, even though during their day job, it's a very creative, lots of times work they do, they still have this desire to do their own projects on the side. And
Hmm.
that's kind of how this started for me. So I always had a bug to be doing something. And it actually was a kind of a webcomic bug for me at first. And so this story actually started a little bit out as a webcomic. It's not available, so it's not worth trying to look up. But it started that way, and I did a number of panels and sheets, and then I was kind of writing ahead of what I was going to draw, and I realized I just enjoyed the writing part kind of more, and so it kind of transitioned from a webcomic into more writing and stuff like that. So I didn't realize that I liked writing until I started doing it, and then it kind of grew from there.
Mm. Yeah, that sort of echoes something that I'm kind of relatively familiar with comic artists
Mm-hmm.
who will work for DC or Marvel to pay the bills, but they will work on their own projects, like the stuff that they really want to do through Image or other sort of indie or more creator-owned avenues. Whereas
Right.
they will write Batman or Daredevil or insert superhero here, just to get a constant stream of income to enable them to draw or write all this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
really important as a creative. Like, I mean, I love working on Star Wars films. I've always been a Star Wars fan, or Star Wars TV shows, I should say. Um, I've always been a fan, and it is really satisfying. But I think as a creative, I still feel this pull to kind of just do my own thing and have complete control over everything. Like in Star Wars, you can't just kill any character off or invent anything you want to do. You kind of have to make sure it fits nicely with the world and matches some other things. But as on your own projects, you can kind of just be like, I feel like doing this. And so that's kind of an important thing that I say a lot of creatives do is even if they're doing it professionally, they want to do something where they have total control and kind of explore on their own.
right. Sorry, I want to talk a little bit about Lucasfilm because
Mm-hmm.
I think you know, it's a big thing, and you said I suppose maybe we are of an age. You watch the original trilogy as a kid, and then to find yourself, X many years later working at Lucasfilm must be a bit of a blast. You must be living the dream type thing. So, how did you manage to get there? What was the journey?
Yeah, so I mean, just going back to your original kind of statement is I did kind of grow up with Star Wars. I loved the original 3 episodes, and then also the prequels. I watched those still pretty young, and enjoyed those a lot too. And yeah, growing up, I love Star Wars. I love Lego, and I actually have like some random Legos behind me too, some things I tinker on. But it was really fun eventually to skip and when I was working at Lucasfilm, it was kind of a crazy fun moment where I was like working on the spaceship and they're like, what engine color did this need to be? And they were asking, like, I can't remember what this was. I'm like, oh, I know this. And it was because I was a fan and I spent time playing with Star Wars toys and all that kind of stuff. And it was really fun to be like, oh, I have this knowledge and this interest that I had growing up. So that was really fun. But to go to your question, you were saying like kind of what was the path or the journey there. So for me, it was I always liked doing art. Growing up, I would do paintings and draw and make up little characters and worlds and whatever. And I do a lot of like traditional painting stuff too. But then fairly young, I started doing digital art. So I kind of got this old. It was a bamboo tablet, is what the brand was called or whatever. And I would draw on my computer, and so I really enjoyed that. And then in college, I was doing like some pre-business classes. My mom was like, you should like look into animation because you like art and kind of technology and stuff. And I was like, okay. So I checked it out and I really enjoyed it. And so I got a degree in animation and different internships and jobs later. And now I'm at Lucasfilm. So that's kind of the story.
So, I mean, you can be I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, aggrandizing here, but I'm assuming that to get a job as an animator at Lucasfilm, you cannot be just your average graduate, isn't it? You must have a considerable amount of skill / talent in there.
Well, it is a very competitive industry. Toy Story 1 was kind of the first 3D film released. And what's crazy is it wasn't that long ago. So there's like a lot of people that worked at the beginning of 3D animation that are still in the industry. And there's not like tons and tons more studios now than there used to be. I mean, there are more in some ways, but like there's still not a ton of players. So there's not a lot of spots available always. So it is kind of a competitive industry. And they're iconic, like lots of things that are well known. And so a lot of people are wanting to be part of it too. So I was very fortunate to be able to work at Lucasfilm and I don't know, work hard. I think schooling is important. I've worked with a lot of people that are self-taught that are super talented, but with schooling, sometimes it's helpful to not just learn good information and practice, but also see where they have been and maybe kind of like ask questions and get mentorship and ask and get connected to learn about that kind of stuff. And I was fortunate that I went to a great school and had some friends that had some awesome careers, and I was able to talk with them and kind of learn how they structured and learned and practiced to get to cool places. And I was fortunate.
No. So yeah, always learning, isn't it? And then because as a kid, did you get to play the Star Wars role-playing game?
I maybe played it a couple times, but I never really got into it. I never had any of it myself. I think I played it at a friend's house.
Right. Because like I played it for a while, but it was that massive source of like geeky info because it had like kind of the plans of and the names of all the different starships and all that sort of stuff. So it was like a kind of like a relative deep dive into the extended, because that was the only extended kind of Star Wars universe. I mean, there were a couple of cartoon series. I remember there was a series based on the two droids back in the 90s, an animated series, right? But
yeah, there's a couple older Star Wars things. Yeah, a few old movies that people don't know about, like an Ewok Adventure and some stuff.
And the Christmas special.
The Christmas special. Yeah, that's another one.
So that was the only way to sort of get more of Star Wars. Whereas nowadays, we've got all the TV shows plus the animated stuff and so on, and you can avoid the question if you wish. What's your take on the current significant amount of criticism addressed or aimed at Star Wars, at the Disney Star Wars brand?
Oh, that's a great question. I think everyone has kind of their own answer and feeling. I think as a creative, as I've been at Lucasfilm for 6 years, but I have spent some time at Sony, ImageWorks, working on some of their movies and some other places too. And I feel like no matter where you're at, there's always different tastes and preferences. And I think Star Wars it's been really interesting for me to see and watch people's opinions because there's always differing opinions. Like I think there's the original 3 episodes of Star Wars and there's like the prequels. And there's been like a lot of people like, oh, I didn't like the prequels, or this or that. And there was a divide there, I think, a little bit in the fandom. And I think in a lot of ways this is kind of, and then there was a similar thing with the, I don't know, post quills. I'm not sure, after Disney made the next 3 with Rey. There's another kind of like group that's like, oh, I didn't really like those, and there's some new fans of that and stuff too. And I think TV is just another wave of that. There's a lot of people that don't like it, and there's a lot of people that do like it. And I think there's a lot of preference that happens there. And also, like, you might fall in love with a certain thing of Star Wars, and then if it's different, if there's a new thing, it's not what you kind of have in your head of what Star Wars is, and so you may not like it. And so I totally understand that. And for me, I think one of the other challenges that happens with Star Wars is there's more of it now, right? Like originally there was just 3 movies. I mean, originally there was only 1 movie. And so like the more there's more points to disagree on. And with TV now, especially, there's a lot of content being made. There's multiple shows kind of happening. And so I think there's a lot more areas to have differing opinions. I know for me, I am a big fan of animated Star Wars, which isn't too surprising given my background. And I've really liked kind of all the content there. And that's what I work in. So I kind of also watched Clone Wars. I remember watching some of that in like college and different places. And so I only work in the 3D, the cartoon world for me personally. And then the live action, the TV shows, I've seen some stuff that's fun. But I can see if people, it's not their Star Wars, it's what they gravitate to. I can totally understand that.
Yeah, I think I haven't watched any of the recent TV productions or streaming productions, but I think the general consensus was that the original trilogy was amazing, and even the people that were not into it, they just weren't into it. They wouldn't hate it. It wasn't for them. But the consensus was the original trilogy was this amazing thing, right? As a kid, countless times I've watched that. I'm sure, same as you. You never grew tired of watching it. Then the prequels came, and obviously we were a little bit older. And the consensus again was like, well, they aren't great, but there was a kind of people were being lenient because it was still George Lucas's vision, and how can you argue with him because it's his thing? I think the second it stopped being Lucas's thing and it became part of the whole Disney house. I don't know. Yeah, like you said, people identified the original trilogy and maybe the prequels as that's where Star Wars was, and anything that diverges from it or moves away from it, they don't recognize it as their Star Wars, particularly like the established of the older fans. Yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky one because surely I think we've seen it with any kind of long-standing franchise. At some point, we reach saturation. People just don't care about it anymore. It happened with the Terminator franchise. It happened with the DC EU. Do you think Star Wars is reaching that kind of saturation point where people are fed up and maybe less is better?
I mean, that's a good question. That's not, I mean, I think this is just be my opinion. Like, there's people thinking about that and deciding what to make and what not to make. And I'm just the one that's like, a show is in progress and I'm working on my animated characters and spaceships and stuff, and I have fun with that. So I kind of hope that it goes forever because I love making it. But I can understand that like maybe someone's not interested in it. I think there's kind of that evaluation of like if we're aiming for the masses and the masses don't want it, maybe there's pauses or they pull back in different ways. I think that's what everyone's evaluating, or at Disney, they're always kind of thinking about that and trying to figure out where they should go and how much. So I don't really know how close we are or aren't at that point. I think one of the challenges that is always in the entertainment industry is it's like the kind of the why question, right? So it's like, oh, was this less popular because people need a break in general? Or is it less popular because this particular character didn't resonate, or because this storyline wasn't hitting the spot in this way? Or is it because in general we're a little tired of maybe this world? And so there's all these different reasons and different things. Like I know that some people are fans of this one show and they really love it and they're super excited for the next season, and other people aren't, and that maybe that same person isn't fans of something else. I know like a lot of my friends right now are talking about how excited they are for Andor. And so it's kind of like it's tricky to like, is it the whole thing needs to slow down, or is it like this one didn't quite hit the target? as much.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how close we are or aren't. I'm always surprised when I mean, there's some franchises that just, I feel like Pokemon has been around for a long time and there's still stuff that gets generated or still interested to it. Or like things will get reboots. Like there's Lord of the Rings on Amazon, and there's the books and there's the film.
Let's not talk about Rings of Power. Let's not go there.
Okay, I actually haven't seen it, but it's interesting how like reboots or different things will happen. I mean, Harry Potter's not a good example. It sounds like there's stuff in the works there for some.
Okay, that just breaks my heart.
Sorry, but one of the things I do want to say is no matter what content comes out, and this is something I've thought about a lot too, as I've seen different shows and stuff. If I love maybe the original or something, and there's new stuff that I don't love, I think a lot of people take that personally. But for me, it's like what I love is still there. Like they can't take that away. No one. So it's like no matter what happens with Star Wars or whatever, if there's things I love, I can still love that. I don't have to, in my head, I don't have to expand with it.
It doesn't cancel or nullify what came before.
Mm-hmm.
I think perhaps maybe it makes you appreciate even more.
Oh, but yeah,
the original stuff. Because I think someone that managed that kind of longevity fairly well. I could be off the mark here, but it's Sylvester Stallone with the Rocky franchise, because he took long breaks between, particularly after Rocky 4, which wasn't necessarily great, or Rocky 5, where he took like a long break and then he re-examined the character, as in 20 years down the road, where he's coming for one final hurrah, or he's looking at that character at a very different stage in his life than the first 3-4 movies did. But again, I think he wasn't just making these movies every 2-3 years, particularly after Rocky 4. He took extended breaks, and then the fans they want to go back to this thing that from 10-15 years ago. So I think he managed that well, whereas Indiana Jones, I don't know. I don't know what the rule
there's
is.
long breaks.
yeah, but I don't know why I don't know what's the magic recipe. I'm not intelligent enough to. I
think no one's intelligent enough to know the magic recipe. If anyone ever discovers it, they'll be set up for life.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, and then the last thing, and then we can talk back to the Heretic and writing stuff. Did you LucasArts, the computer games from the 80s and the 90s? Did you play those?
I remember playing the Pod Racer game on the 64, and I loved that one quite a bit. I'm trying to remember when. I guess that was the 90s.
Secret of Monkey Island, Indiana Jones, and The Fate of Atlantis, and all the graphic adventures from LucasArts.
A lot of them I didn't own, but I remember playing some of them at friends' houses and stuff like that. But yeah, I remember LucasArts was, and they made games after that too for a while, but they weren't around forever. I think that division kind of shut down at some point, or at least paused. But they've been making some more Star Wars games again. More, it seems like. I remember really liking some of the old Star Wars games or LucasArts, their other content as well. So did you have I just remember playing some of it.
So excuse my ignorance here. So is what you do, could it be like transferable to working in computer game?
That's a great question. So sorry to cut you off, but it's 3D is interesting. So there's kind of like, in my mind at least, there's 3 big divisions. There's like animated or cartoon, like the modern animated cartoon look. Then there's live action films, and then there's kind of video games. And what's interesting is animation, as I would term it, is in all 3 of them. Like special effects would be the live action. I mean, like if you're making a movie like Avatar, like that whole movie is special effects. Like those characters, they don't exist. So someone's making that whole thing, but it has like a different feel. It's kind of a different approach slightly. And then there's kind of my world, which is more the 3D, other side, the 3D look, and kind of the cartoon world. And then there's video games, which has they can be more realistic or more cartoon or whatever, but they actually all kind of sit on top of a lot of the same technology. And this, I think a lot of skills are transferable. Like there's a little bit different niches and different approaches. Like in video games, you're trying to be careful with loading, kind of, for example, because you're thinking about frame rate, real-time rendering. With films, it doesn't matter how fast the frame loads because you're going to bake it down and save it and put it on a disc and they'll watch it one at a time. But in video games, it has to be generated constantly. And then live action is kind of similar to the other one, but with a different level of realism. In fact, one of my early internships I was doing as part of the test, even though I was going to work on a cartoon show, they had me take a prop from a live action film and me recreate it in 3D to try and be a 1-to-1 match with realism. Right. So that was one of the tests I did, even though I was working on a cartoon show. So like, there are a lot of transferable skills. I feel like people find their niche and maybe more their interest, but a lot of the stuff is pretty similar. And I've helped on video games a little bit in college, and like I said, I did a prop for live action as a test at one point. So there's a lot of carryover.
So hypothetically, would you sidestep into computer game animation / design?
I mean, that's a possibility. I really like where I'm at. And the other thing too is, I guess, another division. You've got video games, film, and then I think you could also, whether it's live action or cartoon, you've got a different category of television. And so television is a little bit different than film because it's shorter. You have like episodes, and there's more content overall, but you break it up into shorter kind of pushes. And I really like that, working at Lucasfilm, working on TV. It's been fun to be like, I'm going to work on this episode. And on this episode, we're on this planet with these characters and doing this thing. But we have to kind of keep it within a certain parameter of time. We don't work on it for years and years, a single episode. And then we work on the next episode. There's kind of like this growing and changing and still kind of like a fast-paced environment in a lot of ways. And I've liked that. I like that we don't just get stuck forever on a single story or film. While sometimes with film and video games, you work on the same project for years and years. And so you're not really getting maybe the change of pace that we get in TV. Although there's really cool things in video games and full-length film. But I like TV.
Okay.
Right now.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sort of satisfying my curiosity. I could carry on asking you about your work over there at Lucasfilm, but we're here to talk about your book. So let's do that because this is what we're here for. So then, the Heretic. You said you always had this creative thing, and you wanted to get it out. It's been every book is a labor of love. It takes years. It's amazing how quickly people can read a book, and how long it takes to write. So, how long did it take you to write the book?
That's a great question. It kind of, start date to end date.
Because you mentioned the drafts and the first draft and the ideas and all that stuff. So
I would say overall it took me about 5 years, but there's at least a full year where I didn't write at all, and then some other big chunks where I didn't write, and that's a big part of this kids and some other things like that. But so I'd say maybe it was 3 years of working time, and maybe 5 years of time that passed from when I started to when I finished to some degree, and yeah. So yeah, it takes a long time.
And so at this moment in the conversation, I should say that perhaps there may be some spoilers ahead, but we're going to try not to. So I just want to ask you first about, I found the setting, the world that you've created for the Heretic was quite interesting for me, because it's not your traditional European medieval fantasy setting. It's got a whiff of the steampunk, but it's not steam powered. It's this construct magically powered. What is it?
That's a great question, and I like how you describe it too, because in my head it was kind of like, it's like steampunk but without the steam.
Yeah.
Not so many gears. It's more. I guess the way I describe it is, it's kind of like if coding was magic, like programming languages was magic. And so instead of typing into a computer to execute a virtual program, you're writing it with ink on an object, and that makes something happen. And so it feels a little bit, because it's more magical in that sense. It feels almost more modern than steampunk to me in the way it happens, because there's less of like this like obvious industrial stuff moving, like, oh, this gear, this joint, this giant pivot. It's a little more like I wrote these things down and kind of connected these things together, these lines in magic, and that makes the light bulb turn on. So I feel like in some ways that's how modern life feels like, because it's like, oh, there's these hidden wires and Wi-Fi and internet, and so it's kind of like this more behind the scenes magic. And in this
Yeah.
world, it's kind of like this. It is magic that kind of does a lot of that
So
stuff.
it's somewhere in between. Just for the sake of labeling things, isn't it? It's somewhere between steampunk and cyberpunk.
Yeah, maybe.
It's kind of like techno punk,
Magic punk or something.
Yeah. It is. But I found the setting very interesting and very unique. So I appreciated that for it was. And so trying to imagine the world was a little bit weird because you've got, trams or, trains, and you got these big elevator contraptions and all the stuff. But yet the technology doesn't seem that advanced because it's magically powered. So it's kind of I don't know what kind of century setting would it be?
Yeah, so in my head, a lot of it was kind of a little bit like Renaissance-esque, is what I would imagine. Like, I mean, their weapons, like Renaissance, you're kind of getting, that's a tricky time frame. It might be a little pre-early that, but like you got like crossbows is more of a thing, as opposed to like they don't really use gunpowder, so it's pre that. But then like their glass work and their metal work feels more Renaissance level in my head. Like you need that to kind of be able to build an elevator shaft and rail tracks, kind of things like that. So I'm thinking, I kind of imagine Renaissance, and maybe that's also architecture in my head. So that's kind of where I label it. Now, in this world, it's gone a different path because of the rune magic and those things, but that's kind of how I see it. A little bit more Renaissance-esque.
Yeah.
Period.
And I think as well, I kind of struggle a little bit with understanding the magic system, for want of for better expression, because I think at one point, your main character, doesn't he? I think he builds like a set of like a rotors, like a set of cogs out of paper when he's trying to crack a code. So he magically powers these paper cogs that spin and turn it. Did I get that right?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, this world, the magic system is all about writing for the most part. So, like, if I was to simplify it down, you might have like a character that's like light, and then you'd say connecting it to this person who's going to get the energy for the light. And this is the tube, the metal tube that you're going to make glow. And so that's kind of like the basic instruction. And then once that's all written down in gold, which is kind of how they use it in that world, and the person connects, the light bulb can turn on. So that's like a really simplified idea of the runic technology that they have. But then it just layers of complication. Just like programming, you might say, okay, here's the light, the bar, I'm going to say glow, and I want you to glow, meaning light, and this is the person that's powering it. And you say, no, but if that person taps this point on the wall, it'll turn it off. So that's a little bit more complicated. So like you keep layering levels of complication, and what my main character, what Damien did in this example, when you're saying when he was breaking into the door, the lock, he was like, okay, so these locks, what they need is a special string of, it's called a unique identifier. Every person, they get like essentially a tattoo that says their identifier. And so it's like, it needs a certain string of code to unlock this door, like 011583, except for it's not numbers, but that kind of idea. So what he did is he made a little spinning wheel with different numbers on it. And he had his rune magic would go through and just try each one. So it would rotate through it and try out some different combinations. And since you can spin a piece of paper really fast, it could try a lot of different combinations really fast. And that's kind of how the logic worked there.
So a bit like an Enigma machine type thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So where did the idea or the inspiration for this magic system come from? Because like I said, it's fairly unique, I think.
I think that's a good question. I think a lot of times, just growing up, I love fiction and fantasy, and there's kind of like different stereotypical types of magic, and one of them is like written magic, right? So you have like spell cast magic where people are talking. There's other kinds where it's like, I guess it's like internal, and they just like think and feel and shoot fire with their hands or whatever, which there is some fire in my book, shooting fire and stuff. But I really always liked the written magic. I thought that was kind of cool. And I feel like people were underutilizing that potential, particularly technologically speaking. Like if you could write down magic, and have things happen based off of what was written, then I feel like that would change kind of the way the world came about and kind of the technologies that were developed, because it's not just the person who knows the magic, but if you can record it and hand it to someone else, now someone else has this little piece of magic. And that's kind of, I guess, in some ways where I got what I liked about it. And I just remember seeing like runes. I didn't make up that word. It's like that written magic is kind of this thing that's existed in other pieces of fiction and fantasy. So
no, I think there was an inspired piece of I don't know, insight or creativity there. I really enjoyed that. And then I'm assuming, made a very deliberate choice to make your main character crippled, and the reason he is sort of fairly well explained and introduced at the beginning of the book. Why?
That's a great question. So for me, there's a couple things that I wanted to be in my book, and this is even back to my original as a comic. Some of these things were there, and one of them, this is not what you're asking, but he had parents. Both his parents were alive. Now there's interesting relationships with some of his parents, with his dad in the book and different things. But I feel like a lot of stories, the parents are gone or deceased or whatever. And so I wanted his parents to be alive and kind of maybe part of the story. That's something I wanted to have in the book. Another thing I wanted to have in the book is I wanted him to have a physical ailment, partly because it's visual. I'm a very visual person, but I think we all have different challenges in our life. Whether that is physical or emotional or mental or something else. And I wanted it to have my character have something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I made it physical because it's kind of obvious and upfront. And for me, that was easier to write in than like maybe a mental or something like that. And I think there's some pretty cool things out there in that regards, but I thought physical was a good way for me to kind of show maybe a limitation he had and have it be prevalent through the stories. Yeah.
Okay. Although if you will allow me, that's the one thing for me that didn't quite work, because you send him off to this military training.
Mm-hmm. And he has one arm.
Yeah. And the struggle didn't, I think the struggle should have been harder.
Sure.
Or I was kind of expecting him to fail. So I don't know. But just my impression, my take. I know you can tell me why I'm wrong.
Oh, you're not wrong. I think one of the things that's important is everyone has a valid opinion. And so like, if it didn't work for you, if I didn't write that quite well enough for what you were envisioning or hoping, then that's a valid opinion. I could tell you some of my thoughts and maybe my struggles there. But like, so for me, like in the story, I try to be like, okay, so he gets to the school not because he's the best school person, but because his dad had connections and his dad needed something from him. Also, this is probably spoilers. So kind of harkening back to what you said earlier. Yeah. So like there's extenuating circumstances that got him into the school, which would have been hard otherwise.
And that was fine. And that was perfectly fine there.
The other thing was in the school. So there's two things here. One is in the school, there is this stuff called Vival that kind of gives you extra energy. And to me, that was kind of like, I used that a little bit. I leaned on it to be like, okay, this is how he's able to get through some of these things, since he's not like a trained ninja or whatever. So he can kind of lean on that energy, the extra kind of boost of energy to kind of help him out. And then, so the other side is like the failing side, right? So like he has a struggle with one arm. He's not a traditional candidate in this school. And I think I kind of try to show that through the proctor, Torin, like really disliking him and really not believing in him and saying you're going to fail and do all these things. And at different versions of the draft, I like try to amp that up to show it. But it was always a tricky balance for me to be like, is that the focus of the book, or is the focus kind of like his mission and what he's trying to solve? And maybe I could have sold it better with like his struggles and maybe how he didn't quite make it as a traditional candidate in this school. But I was kind of like focusing more maybe on like his mission, different things like that. So I could see that being like needed to be built up more.
Yeah, because the Bible thing, again, I'm really sorry. I think that was kind of you get out of jail card. Because I was expecting, like, I don't mind that, but again, I don't think the consequences of the over reliance on that came to fruition. Maybe later. I don't know. I reserve judgment because how many books do you intend to?
Yeah, so this is supposed to be a trilogy, and that is something. I mean, I think this is the lame answer when it's like, oh yeah, that's gonna be big in the next book, because it's like it's only there if it's there. So when the next book is out, then you can be like, yes, it's there or it's not, you know. But that is something that big consequences. I kind of was trying to hint at that towards this book, like it's kind of like an addiction. He's overly relying on it. Some other people are like, you probably shouldn't be doing this that much. And so that is something that is going to kind of come crashing on him a little bit in the second book. At least that's my plan.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, sorry. Sometimes I feel like telling a writer like the bits that didn't work for me. I don't know. I feel like, who are you to tell me, about my right, all that sort of stuff. But,
you're totally fine. I mean, a couple comments there is one, my job, like my day job, and then as an author, all I do is do art and get feedback. The director's saying, oh, this needs to be changed for these reasons, or even if everything's finished, the director likes it, we release a show, and then the audience or the crowds or people, they say, oh, I didn't like this or I like that. So like that's just part of life for me, and I'm totally fine with it. To me, it's always like, I love talking about it. It's like you have thoughts about something I made, and that's fun. We're talking about Bible, and you wouldn't have talked about it if I didn't write it, right? Like it wouldn't be a thing. So it's, and if you have preferences or think that it could have been done better, I don't feel hurt by that. And it's like an opportunity for me, like, okay, how could I improve myself as a creator and try to do better maybe next time? Or maybe I disagree, and that's fine too. But I think these dialogues are fine and fun.
It's just that, so because I've seen. I mean, okay. So another kind of quick question, quick answer. So, like, have you got an extended fantasy reading background?
Yeah, I've read a lot of fantasy.
Right. So for me, like and I blame Brandon Sanderson for all this, is the whole hard magic system, right? He's got like this magic system with these clear rules and consequences and da. But yet, and I've only read Mistborn, but it just so happens that his main character is the one only person ever in the history of the world that has got this extra resistance to this, or that can actually twist this thing the other way. And I don't want to see that, because I think it's like you've made all these rules and then you cheat your way out of your own self-imposed constraints.
It's kind of like the plot armor.
And I don't want to see that. So I just want consistency. If I say you, any author, if you impose these constraints and you set up this framework in which the magic is going to function and the characters are going to operate in, just because he's your main character, he cannot have that special power that allows him to bend the rules, in my opinion. But that's just a preference.
Yeah, that's a great. It's kind of that challenge. I think it's interesting with hard magic, particularly because you're like, you said these things, you kind of made these promises to the reader essentially, and then it's like, but are you following it? And that's true with hard magic particularly, but even with like soft magic, and even in non-fictional stories, or not in fiction probably, but like in non-fantasy, I should say, you as an author, you're kind of creating this environment and creating these scenarios, and if the main character can just waltz through it all, and it's like, why are they special? Like, what mechanism is allowing them to just like, oh, this is the first time you picked up a bow and arrow, but you're suddenly a master. Like, how does that work? And that's like maybe more like a soft kind of skill as opposed to like a hardly explained like magic system. But I think that's something that's really important to me, and I want to do good at that. And it's kind of a tricky balance. It's like, why is this character? Why can they do what they're doing? And does that make sense? And is that fair? And is the physics of the world you kind of created? So, did you have a kind of a question about maybe where it seemed like my character wasn't following that, or something, or are you just
like it was just the we've discussed the over reliance on Bible. Yeah, and it's like, oh please, like I am expecting something to go wrong, to be consequences there, because otherwise I will feel cheated.
Right. It's like, oh, if you want to take on the big evil emperor, all you need is like this Bible.
Yeah,
like, anyone could have done it.
Well, or if only Damien could do it, like why, and it's going to be a really well fleshed out reason other than he's the chosen one or he's
Right.
the main character, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Another thing that caught my attention, this is maybe a bit ridiculous, but it's another part of the book that I really enjoyed for personal reasons, is the card game that they play, which was the name of the game they play.
It's called Radiate.
Radiate, right. Question. Have you got a fully fleshed out game in your mind, or are you just dropping bits and pieces, hoping that no one corrects it? Like
Tries to play it and it doesn't work.
Yeah. Have you created that card game?
Yes and no. So I have created it and I've played it. And it's based off of, I don't know if you've played, it's like a suit-based trump game, essentially. So if you've played spades or hearts or up and down the river, it's kind of like one of those games in a lot of ways. I have a couple changes to that game for Radiate. But one of the things I haven't fleshed out is how you gamble with it. Like, I don't understand how you gamble with a suit-based game so much. I'm like, do you put all the money in at the beginning and then you can't change your bid, or like? So I've kind of said some things in the book where I'm like, I need to make sure I figure out how to actually gamble with this game. But like,
okay.
But besides that, I do know how to play Radiate.
If you want to get deep gig, because there's a Spanish card game called Mus, M-U-S. You're probably not going to find rules in English, but it's kind of like, well, you're playing, first of all, you're playing pairs against another pair, right? And it's a bit like Radiate. Depending on your position in the game, you got preference. So if you are like, you got first preference, second preference, third preference, and then the last, and that rotates as the game goes on, right? But it's a bit like poker, but you make bets based on your cards, but there's 4 different rounds of betting with the same hand of cards. So in the first hand, you bet on who's got the most knights, or sorry, the most kings. On the Spanish deck is kings, right? Then the second round of betting with the same card is like who's got the most aces, because the king is the highest card and the ace is the lowest card. So in the first hand, who's got the highest card? Second round, so a good hand in the first round is a really rubbish hand in the second round. So then what are people playing at? In the third round, you play to see who's got like 1 pair, 2 pair, 3 of a kind. So now card combinations, it doesn't matter whether they are kings or aces or whatever. And then in the final 4th round of betting, it's about the point total of the cards.
Okay.
So you add the value of the cards, and whoever's got the highest value. So you can play with the same hand of cards 4 different bets. And then you're trying to guess what your opponents are betting on. Have they got a good hand for the kings, or are they playing for points, or what? And it kind of reminded me of that Radiate. And then with this whole, in the case of a draw, whoever's got the preference in that round wins, and then they become, and so on. So if you want to go down and then you bet up to a certain number. Yeah, that's right.
Interesting. Yeah.
Sorry, long.
No, that's good.
Long diatribe you didn't care about, but my grandfather used to bet his food rations in World War II playing Mus with the people.
Really?
Yeah. So, and he taught me to play the game. So it's whenever I see a card game kind of fleshed out in a book, it does remind me of that. And I really enjoyed it.
Did you also think of it because they actually bet with food in my book?
Yeah. It brought back all those things. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I'm sure you can find it there.
That's cool. I'll definitely look up Mus. And that looks like a fun thing to learn. It's also, I said spades and queens and on the river, but I've mixed in some other games too. So there's like, because you're right that in the game you're describing, it changes based off of what round you're in. But in my game, one of the things that changes is like what your player position is. If you're the hero or the heretic, it changes kind of some of the stuff. So that's right. That's interesting.
And as well, there's like an established set of signals that you send your partner. So if you wink your eye, it means you got 31 points, but then you run the risk that the other pair can catch you passing the signals, or you can signal that you got two pairs or two kings or whatever. So this a whole set of signals that are the
That's fun.
official, and then you're trying to convey information to your partner so that he can play with your cards against the other two. And
Right.
so,
That sounds like a Rook a little bit. I don't know if you've played Rook, but it's you're paired with someone else. You don't know their cards, but you're trying to achieve a goal together. And so yeah, you're trying to like signal each other or be like, oh, this person bid really high, so maybe I should let them take this or not. You know, it's different things. That's
yeah,
fun when you do paired playing as a team.
yeah, that's right. I was gonna say, right. So I've got so many questions. Editing of your book. Once it was finished, what was the editing process? Did you find someone to do it? Did you just pass it around to loving wife, siblings, friends? Well,
Yeah, combination. So I mean, the editing process. If I had a number of beta readers, some friends that are into fantasy, and some family members. So I reached out to them, told them I'm writing a book, and I said, this is what I'm going to give it to you, and what I'd like feedback on specifically, kind of formatted it that way. I did that. I did a couple rounds of beta readers, and then I also went and hired at that point, I felt pretty good about kind of the main story. So I went and hired a couple editors for more line editing. For the most part, I had two editors that I went to kind of for the final polish, and they did give me feedback about like, this part didn't make sense, or this was a little slow, but it was a little bit less big picture. And so that's kind of the main two things. Is I did hire professional editors, and then I also had, I guess, amateur beta readers, just people that liked fantasy and had them read and get their feedback. And then through the whole process, my loving wife read. I probably have like, every version of my book. She's definitely read every time and given me tons of feedback. And one of the things I love about her in the editing process is she's actually not a fantasy fan. And it's been really helpful for her to be like, why? This doesn't make sense. And I'm like, well, it just like, it's a fantasy thing. She's like, that doesn't work. You can't just like say it's fantasy. So like, she's really good at like focusing or helping me focus on character and like kind of the thought process behind things. And I really appreciated her feedback on that. And then she understands fantasy, and I've read fantasy with her and watched shows and different things, but it's been a lot of editing process. And I think I'm excited moving forward to kind of take some things I've learned. And now that I've published it and gotten even more feedback from people, I had ARC readers, so advanced reader copies, and then also just people that have read my book and kind of made comments or different things. I'm like, okay, so this is some good things for me to think about as I'm working on future books.
And the publishing process, because is this independently published?
Yeah.
So did you try to get a traditional publishing house or an agent? Did you sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, did you market your book around before?
Yeah, so I mean, query, I think, is kind of some of the terms that is used. I did query my book to different agents, and I reached out to, I don't know, 50 or so different people maybe, and I didn't get a lot of feedback. One of them, I had a couple people say this is really good and they like it, but they don't feel like fantasy is like really working right now. I'm not sure why, but it seems like a lot of agents are a little scared of big fantasy books, particularly with new authors. So I think it's a pretty hard sell for a debut. And I also like wrote a big book, and it's a series, and I'm an untested author. So I think a lot of agents weren't super interested. Like they see my word count and they're like, nah, never mind.
Well,
but also maybe it's just not their thing, or I'm not good at it. But either way, I didn't get an agent.
No, because talking to people, which is what I try to do. So I talked to Sanderson's agent. He's the chairman of a literary agency there, and he's like still positive about fantasy. But a couple of other people I've talked to, other authors, I think these days, for whatever the reason, printing costs are quite high. And I know of authors that have published and they've been asked to trim down significantly their books in order to get published. And usually I do complain about that a book never needs to be as long as it is to tell the story that it does. Yet the last two books that I've read from new authors is like, no, this needed an extra
More.
100 page. Yeah.
Interesting.
So I think there are constraints in the industry. Unless you are a well-established author, I think they're trying to keep page counts below 400.
I think that also makes sense from a publishing standpoint. Like when I hired editors, like, I mean, it's expensive and they charge by the word, which makes sense. And so having a longer book, everything is more expensive. Like printing, there's more pages to print, there's more pages to edit, there's more just more to do. So the cost is bigger, so the margins get worse. So I can understand, especially with not being established, I can see why agents or publishers are pushing for shorter. And maybe that's helpful in some ways. It's interesting to hear from you that you feel like some books you've read recently seem too short. I'm sure my book, like, could have, like, if I tried harder, maybe I could have shortened it down and maybe tightened it up in quality from that. But I think it's interesting to hear that it's been tightened too far. That's an interesting.
No, I think in your case, I only thought that the middle section, when he's at the training military school, just went on for a touch too long. But that's nitpicking. Like it didn't drag at any point. I just felt that bit there could have just been a little bit shorter, because it got a little bit kind of maybe slightly repetitive with his night capades trying to figure things out. But I get it. But that's fine. But no, I've had other people tell me that, they were like, how much more do you want me to cut? Like, I cannot cut any.
There's nothing left to cut unless you're cutting story.
Without getting really sort of maiming the book. And in about 10 hours time, I'm meant to be live again with another author, and I've got a feeling I'll ask him that I think he got asked to trim his word count as well. Seems to be a thing going on at the moment.
The cost, you're balancing that, I'm sure, is particularly in that world. If you're an agent or a publisher, that's what you're thinking a lot about. But I just think it's also interesting because, like, for me, there's the digital format, and, like, besides the cost of getting editors and things like that, like, it doesn't cost more for me to print a long book or a short book when it's an EPUB file, when it's digital. So there's at least that side of things too. So I wonder if that helps. It clearly doesn't do enough, but it'd be interesting to see if that balances more. But I don't know. I mean, you're still editing every word. If you're doing an audio book, you're still paying or reading every word.
Yeah.
So, I mean, everything. The longer, the more expensive.
Yeah. I mean, the crazy one. It's I don't know. Do you know Christopher Rocchio? His Sonita series.
Oh yeah.
So on the sixth book that came out earlier this year, his editor, I think he chopped off 20,000 words from
20,000.
Yeah. That's almost like a novella. They've taken and it's still a fairly chunky book. I think it's so. Yeah, it's crazy. But then obviously Rocchio has hit it relatively big, so I think he's allowed to have these longer novels.
And yeah, I mean, the other thing too is, like, 20,000 words sounds like a lot, but if you wrote a 300,000 word book, that's like a pretty small percentage.
Yeah.
Relatively. So it's, I mean, I don't know how long his books are, but they're kind of chunky.
Yeah. I mean, if you got a 900-page book, to trim it down to 700, possibly you are not causing too much damage.
Potentially.
But I think if you got a 450-page book and you're trying to take 100 pages off, I think that's where things start to get
totally
tricky there. Right. So how did you go about them publicizing your book? And this is a leading question into the next bit I want to ask you. So
sure.
You've written your book, you got it there, it's all bound, printed, I don't know, digital. How did you go about promoting it?
So I mean, that's something I'm still learning, but one of the things I did is with ARC readers, so advanced reader copies, I reached out to a lot of my friends and asked for their friends that they had friends that read fantasy. And so I gave a lot of free copies of the book away. I actually gave out 400 copies, and I got commitments from 400 people to read my book and give it like a review on Amazon or something. So that took a lot of effort kind of in advance of the final, because that was supposed to be a month before it was released, finally released. It was, I did that kind of leading up to it. So on the day of the release, there was 400 people that were supposed to kind of like review the book. So that was one thing I did. The fall off rate of that was pretty intense. I didn't get 400 reviews, but I got a lot.
Because 400, that's a lot of friends.
I mean, I don't have quite 400 friends. I definitely had less than that, but I was able to get friends of friends kind of reading it too. What's interesting is a lot of them would start reading the book and then I would hear about their friends. So I'm sure it's like, okay, you're my friend. Will you read this book? And they're like, okay, I'll read it for you, but I'm not going to give it to my friend. And then they start reading it. And they're like, oh, I actually like this. I would be willing to give it to my friend. So it kind of, the list grew and I kind of would follow up with people a little bit and say, hey, is there anyone else that you think might be interested in this or whatnot? So it grew. It took me a little while, but I grew the list to 400 people. And that was my goal, is to do 400, because I wanted this book. I care about this, right? It's a labor of love, and I want to kind of have a chance in the world of publishing. So that was a goal I had to get all the way up to 400, and I hit that goal. So I was pretty proud of that. So that's one thing I did. What's I been doing? I tried Amazon ads. That's been kind of interesting, mixed. I've done some free. Yeah,
I haven't heard very nice things about Amazon ads from other authors. Did it do something for you?
It was, I mean, so the final way of evaluating kind of any effort is, cost this much money, and then how many copies did you sell? I guess there's my hands. This much, and then how many you sell. And I think if you spend a lot more money on the ads than you sell, then it's like, well, you don't have a good experience with it. And I think it's tricky in different ways. So people are like, oh, if you have more books, it's more successful, because then if they click on you as an author, then they might buy multiple books or whatever. For me, I didn't sell more copies than I spent on Amazon ads. So it wasn't like amazing, but I'm sure there's like people that do it successfully. I don't know. I think it was still worth it for me to some degree.
Right. Someone must have, but I haven't heard of anyone.
Yeah.
Not that I obviously know a lot of people, but
right.
Anyone watching now, listening now, if you head over to the pagechewing.com forums, there's a lot of indie authors there talking about their experiences and trying to get their works out there. So because do you feel hopeful? Because I think in one of the interviews in the other podcast over at Page Chewing, I think there was one of the stats like is really bleak. There are hundreds of thousands of books being published every year. It's like the odds are stacked against not you, but like any aspiring author. This is not going to be your full-time job anytime soon.
Yeah, it's intimidating. I think there's kind of two things with that. One, it's like, do I want to give it my all, and if it doesn't hit big, but it has some success and it's been fun for me to write and fun for some people to read, I think that's a success. I think even if you enjoyed writing it and this is something you wanted to do and no one reads it, that can be a success too. Mm-hmm. But the other side of it is I do want it to be big. I'd love for a lot of people to read it and a lot of people to love it. And for me, you kind of have to have just hope. Like there's so much you can do, and there's also just waiting and chance to see if the right people see it or if enough people kind of hear about it, kind of thing. And for me, it's like, I think I like the book I wrote. I'm a fan of it. And if I have faith in it, then I think maybe someday it'll work out, even if it's not right now, even if it takes a long time. So it's kind of me. It's like, I'm hopeful still, even if my efforts in the end of publicizing it aren't really what makes it happen. I still have hope that someday it'll kind of gain enough traction and kind of take off.
I wouldn't recommend anyone to set out to become an author. I think you need to do it as a side job and view it as a low risk, low reward kind of endeavor. It's almost like playing the lottery, isn't it? There's a very small chance that you're going to make it big, but I think on the main, because I think the numbers are very humbling. If you look at how many books get published every year,
it is crazy.
It's crazy. And then some books, when I was talking to Joshua Bilmes, Sanderson's agent, some books get sold to a traditional publisher for like $3, $4, $5 grand. Like that's not going to make you quit your day job.
No, I mean, even that, like I spent more than that in editing. Like, so, I mean, So it's like yeah, you can't quit. You can't live off of that for sure. Even if it's like, say you get $50,000 or something like that, that's still kind of that's a lot of effort. It's say you take multiple years to write a book. That's a lot of effort for that. So
yeah, and
that,
yeah, 50,000 every 5 years is not really
livable.
Yeah. What's I going to say? Oh yeah. So, what's your experience been like about reaching people like me on YouTube or Book Talk? I think is a thing. I don't have TikTok. I never will have TikTok, but I think it's a thing. And in the social media sphere.
Yeah, so that's been an interesting process too, because that's another thing I've been trying to do is I reach out to different booktubers like you, and it's been pretty good. I mean, I've done a lot of emails. There's not, from what I see, I don't see there's like a way to directly contact people on YouTube unless you're doing comments. And I feel like it's kind of weird to be like, I liked your video. Will you read my book on a comment? Like, I feel like that's weird. I don't know. So sometimes different YouTube creators like yourself will put their email in your biography or whatnot. And so I've been reaching out to YouTubers that way. And I don't know how many YouTubers I've reached out to. I don't know, maybe 50 or so far. And a lot of people have been really nice and said, oh, yeah, I might be willing to read this. It might take me some time or whatnot if you send me a copy. So I've had a lot of people be kind and say they might be interested. I think you're the first to finish reading it and to do a review for sure. And I really appreciate that.
Oh, no, thank you. But it was just a leading question to something we were discussing over at Page Chewing, that apparently some reviewers are asking authors money in exchange for the review. Have you encountered that?
I have encountered that. I think only once actually, and I said thank you, but I think partly because everyone's trying to make it work, and maybe your passion is reading books and reviewing it, and if there's, I don't know, maybe you need some more money to have it happen or something. So I can understand why people would do that. But partly because of my budget, I don't have money just to throw at everything. So I can't do all that always. But I also think that, and maybe people have different opinions, but I think that like the idea of it's like it's not paid makes it seem more, at least there's a type of genuineness from that sometimes, where it's like people talk about that with sponsorships, right? Like, well, who's going to be like, oh, this company said review my product, and you're like, and I'll pay you this money to do that. And like, I can give them a bad review because you want them to come back and pay you more money in the future. So I don't know. I think there's kind of a tricky conflict of interest sometimes. So I think sometimes doing the free review.
Well, it seems that nobody remembers the role of the rating agencies in the 2008 credit crunch, isn't it? So there's that. Out of curiosity, so how much were they charging you for reviewing your book?
I can't remember. They had different packages. It was like, I'll do this for this much and this for this much and whatnot.
Oh wow!
But I don't even remember.
that sounds way too thought out and way too professional.
Yeah, I don't know. I get a lot of that on Instagram as well. I definitely get more of it than from BookTube. So like I've made a couple posts on Instagram, and I'll have book reviewers on Instagram say, "Hey, I'd love to read your book." And it's like, cool, I'd love for you to read it. And then they'd say, okay, it costs this much. And I'll be like, okay, well, no thanks. But I get a lot of it there for sure.
All right. I'm trying to make up my, well, no, I was going to say I'm trying to make up my mind about it, but no, I think it's intrinsically wrong because of that moral hazard. Like, how reliable would my opinion be if you have paid me, I don't know what amount of dollars to review your book? And then sorry, yeah, go on. No, go on.
I was to say Amazon, for example, like if they find out you're paying people to give you reviews, they'll like, I don't know, it's against a contract, and they'll either remove the reviews or your book or whatever. I don't know exactly the penalties, but like that's like in the rules, like you're not supposed to pay people for reviews on Amazon.
Right.
So I mean, like clearly some people feel that that's not valid. Even companies feel that's not valid. So
yeah. No, fair enough. I couldn't think of, as much as I would love to live off YouTube and reading books, which is never going to happen. I'm not entirely sure that's the way I would go about it. That it just cannot work. in my mind. To write fantasy, do you think you need to come from that fantasy reading background? Is it important to have that well of knowledge or having read the milestones in the genre?
That's a good question. I think yes and no. Like, I think it's kind of cool. Everyone can come from their own path. Like maybe here's an example. So lit RPG is kind of like this growing genre. It's been pretty popular recently, and I feel like obviously a lot of that has come from maybe more tabletop games. Sometimes it feels like an anime influence and stuff like that. So I think people having their own background, maybe not so much the classics, and maybe they've read the classics too. I'm not saying RPG hasn't done that, but like having your own experiences and backgrounds, I think, can bring some interesting things to the fantasy genre, even if you haven't read a lot of the other fantasy genre. But for me, I think that it is very helpful to be familiar with the genre you're writing in, or at least the broader genre. Like, do I think every person who's written a fantasy book needs to read Lord of the Rings? I don't think that's required.
Definitely,
yeah,
yes.
definitely required. I think it's good. I think it's good to have read what you like to read in that genre. So, I mean, I've read a lot of fantasy and I've enjoyed it, and it's also amazing because there's so much of it. Like, I'm like looking for new books, and I'm like, I know there's so many amazing books I haven't read, and I'm always looking.
It's interesting because I haven't made up my mind. Like originally and instinctively, I would say like, yes, you must have read this, that, the other. But then I interviewed last year another indie author, Robert Bone, and he came from a computer game design background. So he hadn't really read that much, and he started writing fantasy, and he was more approaching it from coming from that background and thinking about maybe what would look cool and what would be cool elements to have in the story, and that sort of made me sort of change my mind a little bit. So what would be like your required sort of background before you put pen to paper? You must have read, I don't know, these 3 series of books or whatever.
I mean, there's preference, right? For that's kind of a different way. It's like what are your favorite books? Let me see. I would say I mean, like, I think it's helpful to have a mix. I guess this is why it's different than what I said, but like, I think it's helpful to have a mix of some different stages of fantasy. Like, Tolkien has written, like, kind of sometimes it's called the father of fantasy and different things like that. So it's like reading some classics, I think, is really helpful. I think it's really important to read contemporary, like currently what's trending or popular, because I think you need to understand kind of where fantasies come from and maybe some of the language that was used, because a lot of what we do in fantasy is shorthand, right? When you say, there's an elf and they're coming into this tavern, like, readers of fantasy know what an elf is, and maybe it's still important to kind of be clear. It's like they're human size. I don't know, like explaining a few things, maybe how it's different.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
So I think understanding kind of where some of the core language comes from, I think, is pretty helpful. And then contemporary, because like one of the things that Tolkien did is he spent a lot more time in his intro. He spent a lot more time in The Hobbit, in the Shire, than maybe contemporary fantasy books. It's like jump into the action right away. And so maybe seeing kind of like what are readers reading now and why and what's interesting. So I think kind of a breadth. So I would say almost more like I care more about like read whatever your favorites are, some contemporary, and then maybe some older things, whether that's Tolkien being kind of some of the first earlier things, or if it's, I don't know. And I think everyone has everything but Robin Hobbs or who wrote Wizard of Earthsea? I can't remember.
Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah. I think it's just important to kind of have some breadth of where it comes from. I think that's helpful, at least for me.
Yeah. So I found 2 questions. I'm going to try to not forget the second one. I just found that the more you read in a genre, like once you read Tolkien, Martin, Hobbes, perhaps Abercrombie, everything that comes after is like, oh, this is not good enough. Like I just want to read like really good series, and there's a slight sense of disappointment with everything else because it's not Tolkien, Hobb, Abercrombie, Martin. He bloody finishes those last two books. You know what I mean?
I think that's what everyone. That's kind of one of the camaraderie of fantasy readers is we're always looking for that next high. Of What book is just going to be like? What was the experience when you first read, Lord of the Rings or whatever it was for you? Like, and you're just like, this is the best. And you're always looking. Maybe you find like 3 or 4 of those, but you're wanting that fifth. You want to find it because it was so great.
We're all sort of literally chasing the dragon of that, first fantasy. But
but I do think that people have different. Their 4 might be different, or whatever it is. Like,
and so then my question is there anything left to do in the fantasy genre? Because I'm starting to think more and more that there isn't, although some people do disagree with me and they've explained again why I'm wrong, but I still kind of lean on thinking that everything has been done. The only thing left to do is for the Dark Lord to win, and
I mean, there's different
doom the world to hell, and that I'm looking forward to that book. I'm like that hasn't been written yet.
I mean, the Black Company has. I mean, and there's dark fantasy, right? Is it? Yeah, I mean, there's just tons that's like kind of that to some degree, but the Blade itself, I mean, Joe Abercrombie, all that kind of stuff, that's pretty dark. But I don't know if the bad guys actually win in that.
Yeah, but the problem in there is that there's no bad guys.
Yeah, they're all bad. I guess that's true.
Because there's no good guys. So how can there be bad guys when there's no good guys, right?
But the idea of like, has everything already been made? I mean, that's the thing I hear in the entertainment world. Like, if you're an artist or an author or whatever, it's like, why are you painting that picture? Someone's already painted a human. Like, there's this comic strip I love, and it's like this it's like this person making a web comic on their computer, and they're like, oh, if only I was like the greats. And then it shows someone on like their easel, and they're like drawing Superman, and they're like, oh, if only I was like the greats. And then it shows like Leonardo da Vinci like painting the Sistine Chapel. He's like, oh, if only I was like the greats. And there's this guy, the caveman, and he's like drawing on the wall, and he's like, I'm the best. Like, so it's like, is there a point? And I think, yes, there is always a point, if you can't compete with some of these other things, there's still value to creating art yourself. And I think there's still value. People are still consuming art. Like, we love art in all its forms. So even if it's not like, you're not the composer of all time, if you're not the author of all time, I think we still find enjoyment in, the lighter versions or the attempts. Because also, if those authors or artists decide they weren't the best and they never made their art, then we wouldn't have had it too. So I think it's always worth adding more, because you never know what's going to happen.
Oh, I feel like so positive and so uplifting. Thanks for that. I'll take your point. I think you make a very valid and a very good point. And maybe I just need to, I don't know, just maybe give the genre a little break every now and then. Because I think sometimes when you're too consumed with just the same thing, you start focusing more on the negatives. Like I mentioned before, chasing that high of finding the next great series that, chances are you're not going to find, because we talked about how many books get published out every year. Right. I think, as far as I'm concerned, I think I'm kind of done.
That was a great kind of note to end on.
yeah, absolutely. Although I was going to ask you, is there something that you think, around the genre that we should be talking about, that people aren't talking about, or conversations to be had?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. I don't know. That's interesting. I feel like there's a lot of conversations happening. I mean, there's a lot of like what's happening currently. There's talks about like AI and how that shouldn't be in the industry or whatever, that kind of thing. So I think there's conversations there, which is good. And I think it's always important to be critical and to think and different things. So I'm trying to think of like if there's any conversations I think are lacking in the space.
Is that your children going
Can
crazy?
you hear
or
my
mine?
son yelling for me? Yeah, that's mine.
Okay,
He
okay.
misses me.
No, just
But,
in case it was one of mine, and I had to
yeah.
like sort of run out. It's okay.
Yeah. So
Oh,
I mean,
love it.
I don't know if there's anything particular. I think that one of the things I see, and maybe this is a controversial thought, but I think sometimes we get hung up on what needs to be in a book, and as opposed to what's enjoyable. Like, oh, we need to make sure they're both my kids are young together. But
Great.
like, for example, I was reading a series recently, and this person had this awesome, like, clearly the character flaw was like the main point of the book, and that's, if that's what you like, and that's great. But like for me, I'm like, sometimes I like it when it's just we can write what we like and not necessarily trying to hit an agenda, always. And I think it's great to have representation, all these kind of things. But like, do what you enjoy, write what you enjoy, and I think that's important too. And it's never bad to do that. Never bad to write what you enjoy to some degree.
That's great. Well, last question. So, something that was absent, because what you said that something that was absent from your book was the romance and the love interest for Damien. Is that something that you're gonna not avoid, but like not like because we don't need to have a romance or a love interest in the story for it to work, or is that something that is forthcoming?
That's a great question. So I mean, I am of the camp that not every book has to have romance in it. That is something I believe, at least. But the question is, am I going to put it in this series? Because I don't think it's, on that same note, I don't think it's wrong to have romance in a story, in a fantasy book or whatever. So am I going to put it in? That kind of depends on the plot. I think there's kind of two ways of doing the romance, right? There's like, is that going to be an element that's clearly in the book and part of it, or is it like they finish the book and they ride off into the sunset together, and like that's when the romance starts after the book or whatever. So I'm not sure which route of that I'm going to go with, if it's going to be kind of like let the readers kind of imagine the final step, or if it's going to be like more firmly in the kind of the middle of the book or clearly there. So I haven't decided that.
So for what it's worth, my opinion, I don't think in general men write decent romance. So unless you take the Abercrombie approach, where romance is just reduced to this dirty, filthy exchange of fluids that's just disgusting, I don't think your book's got that tone. I don't know. Maybe just hint at it and just leave it there.
That makes sense as an option too, kind of the ride into the sunset approach or whatever.
Yeah.
The after. Yeah, I don't know. It's true.
I
think Wheel of Time had some interesting romance in it to some degree. And
what? Have you got anything nice to say about the Wheel of Time?
You don't like Wheel of Time?
I can't stand that piece of. I think.
What about Lord of the Rings? Do you like romance in Lord of the Rings?
Okay, you are comparing. I was going to say something politically incorrect.
Oh, I'm not comparing the two. I'm just saying as an example.
Okay.
Because a guy wrote Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, no. So Lord of the Rings, to me, is almost flawless. There's a couple of plot points. Right, but the romance in Wheel of Time, when you turn this one page in whatever book it is, and then all of a sudden, Lan and the horrible one with the braid that no one understands. All of a sudden, and then all of a sudden they're deeply in love with each other, with no build-up whatsoever, with no foreshadowing. You turn the page and they're deeply in love. Like, that's ridiculous. Anyway, I don't think there's a decent piece of romance writing in the Wheel of Time.
Okay, that's fair. I think there's different approaches to it, and I do think one of the things that I think fantasy struggles a little bit, but there's amazing books out there on romance, and I mean, like some of the classics. You got Jane Austen and things like that. Some awesome things out there. So it's like, could you? It's just tricky, and I don't think that's one of the things too. Is it's like, do I feel like I have that skill to write in the amazing stuff? And I'm not confident of that. But I do think that there's a lot of books out there that have a growing relationship, whether or not they get to kind of the final end of that relationship in the book. I think that like people are growing closer together or whatever
Yeah.
through the series, I think it still counts as like a type of romance, even if they're not like, that's not the focus, or they don't finalize that. But I don't know, this is a whole topic unto itself. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
But I get a lot of questions about, in my book, I get a lot of questions about the card game, the questions about Magic, and kind of questions about Damien and his relationships, and kind of like what's going to happen moving forward.
Yeah.
And
No,
I'm always
sorry to interrupt. No, I think
No.
I think rightly so. I think you came up with some pretty interesting and unique ideas, and I will encourage you to carry on writing. And by all means, please get in touch whenever book 2 is ready, because I'll be more than happy to read it.
Well, thank you so much.
And well, I think we got Jared, the fantasy thinker, has been here lurking in the background, but enjoying the conversation. He's a great friend of the channel. Before we go, shamelessly promote yourself. Where can people find your book and about yourself and all that kind of stuff?
Oh, thank you. Probably the best way to find me, and even my book right now, is going to my website, which is just nathanrallen.com. And then from there, you can find my book. It'll link you to Amazon. But yeah, so it's The Heretic by Nathan R. Allen, the first book in Runes and Runes series. And I'd love for you all to read it and let me know what your thoughts are. I think the conversation is one of my favorite parts of being an author, being in this space, is talking about books.
Well, fantastic. Thank you once again, Nathan, for agreeing to this. I've really enjoyed it. And I could have carried on forever, but unfortunately,
My kids are yelling for me.
No, and like I said, I need to be on in 9 hours time. So thank you once again. Thank you, everyone that was watching this live or later on. Everyone, take lots and lots of care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.